Hey guys, it's Quinton with Shoot Center, and today we're going to be talking to you about shotgun ammunition and how it's definitely a little bit different than what you might be used to dealing with when you're looking for ammo for your handgun or for any of your rifle cartridges. Starting off, we're going to talk a little bit about what a shot shell actually is and what it's made out of. So the majority of shells that you're going to encounter on the market today, if not all, are going to be something like this with a plastic hull. Now, a variety of hulls are made by a variety of manufacturers, and not all of them are exactly the same. But for our purposes, buying ammunition, they can be treated the same way. A 12 gauge is a 12 gauge, a 20 gauge is a 20 gauge. And that brings us to our next point, what a gauge is and how you might be able to figure that information out for yourself. So gauge is an antiquated system of measuring bore diameter. We're all familiar with the system in the US anyway of caliber, or how big something is as a proportion of an inch. So a 30 caliber, a .30, or a 45 caliber, a .45 inches. With shotguns, it's a little different. They still use gauge. That came from an English system of grading guns and cannons. A 1 gauge, for example, is the diameter of a lead ball that weighs 1 pound. So as we go down from there, we get divisions of that diameter. So some of the common gauges that you'll encounter, or at least what we had available at time of shooting, we have 10 gauge. The largest of the common bores. We have 12 gauge, and I have a 20 gauge here as well. So a common theme that you'll see as we move forward is, with shotguns anyway, as the number gets smaller, the thing that we're talking about is getting bigger. One more thing of importance to keep in mind when we're talking about gauge and shell length is the actual length of the shell that you're shooting. So most of the common gauges are going to be available in different lengths of shell. That information for what your firearm is capable of chambering safely is usually written right on the barrel of the firearm. If you don't know, feel free to contact the manufacturer if you don't have a manual or if it's not written on your barrel for some reason. But there can be a dramatic difference in size. For example, here's a 2 3/4 inch shell in a 12 gauge, common load, and a 3.5 inch shell in a 10 gauge. Well, in 12 gauge, they also make 3 inch and 3.5 inch chambered shells and shotguns. If you have a 3.5 inch chambered shotgun, you should be able to safely shoot any shell that's shorter than that length. If you have a pump action or a semi-auto and you go shorter than a 2 3/4, you may have an issue cycling that shell. So definitely try those. Something like the Aguila mini shells can cause trouble for a lot of people. But you definitely don't want to run into the problem of chambering too long of a shell in your shotgun. So one thing that can affect that, if you have, say, a 3 inch shell in a 2 3/4 inch chambered gun, is that shells are measured by their open length, not their closed length. So with this crimp, this shell is closer to 2.5 inches in overall length. When it's open, it's 2 3/4. So a 2 3/4 inch chambered shotgun may be capable of chambering a 3 inch shotgun shell, depending on the specifications of that gun and how it was made by the manufacturer. The problem there is that just because it fits in the chamber doesn't mean it will safely fire in your gun. That 3 inch shell, when it goes to open, won't be able to open all the way inside of the chamber of your gun, which can cause a pressure spike, and a really bad day could cause something like a catastrophic failure, which could be an explosion. No one wants their gun to go Elmer Fudd on them, and you definitely don't want to cause irreparable damage to your shotgun or to yourself. One more quick note about shell length is how it could affect your capacity. In a tubular magazine, like most pump action or semi-automatic shotguns have, the overall capacity of those guns is calculated using the shortest available shell for that shotgun. Now, you'll notice here with a couple of different crimp types. One is a star crimp, one is a roll crimp. There is a noticeable difference in length between those two shells. So, if you're using roll crimp shells for your self-defense buckshot or slug loads, or for your birdshot loads, you may only fit one fewer shell in your tubular magazine than you would if you were using star crimp shells. Additionally, if your shotgun says it'll hold 5 rounds and it's chambered in 2 3/4 or 3-inch shells, it may only fit 4 3-inch shells, or even one less than that if they're 3.5-inch shells. Now we'll actually talk about the individual types of shell that you may encounter and what they hold inside. So shotguns are great because they're so diverse. You can use one weapon to hunt many varieties of game or for self-defense, but a lot of people use them for wing shooting. Talking first about birdshot, what you would use for that task or for other small game purposes. What birdshot is essentially is a large number of very small BBs, typically lead, but we'll talk about some different materials later, that are being fired in a pattern to give you as many chances to hit a moving target as possible. Birdshot sizes are going to vary dramatically depending on what type of game you're trying to hunt or what material they're made out of. But common birdshot sizes that you'll see on the shelf are going to go anywhere from number 9 all the way up into the letter grades. But moving from 9 down in numbers, again, just like gauge, as the numbers get smaller, the birdshot sizes, each BB is getting bigger. So number 9 is only a couple thousandths of an inch across. Anything smaller than that they call dust, all the way up into F or double F shot, which is almost the same size as some of the buckshot pellets that we'll talk about. Moving on from the shot sizes themselves and onto the materials that they're made out of, this is really going to affect people that are specifically targeting waterfowl, for example. Federal regulations prohibit the use of lead projectiles when hunting over bodies of water. That includes the pursuit of any migratory waterfowl bird species. So if you're hunting ducks or geese or sandhill cranes, you would need the appropriate shot to do that legally. You definitely don't want to get fined for using the wrong birdshot type. So as an example, I have a load of 2 3/4 number 4 steel shot. Steel is by far the most popular for use with waterfowlers because it's cheap and it's readily available. But there are other ones available, including bismuth, which has been around for a while, that has almost the same density as lead, all the way up to new tungsten super shot or tungsten super 18, which are actually denser than lead. Density matters because with a lead BB, the density of the projectile is going to help you get better penetration on the target, the intended target. So with a steel BB, you typically see larger shells and larger pellet sizes because steel is about half as dense as lead shot. So if you want to know why 3.5-inch Magnum shells exist, it's so you have the payload capacity to fit a similar number of much bigger BBs to give you the same kinetic effect on the target. So some of the other types, like tungsten super shot, you can get the other way. You can use smaller pellets because they're more dense than lead, and they'll give you the same downrange energy as a larger lead pellet, all while being non-toxic. Moving on, we'll talk about buckshot. So if you're not thinking of a shotgun for wing shooting, most of us think of a cylinder bore 18-inch barreled shotgun for home defense or for law enforcement use, and for a lot of people that means buckshot. Now, the most common form on the market by far is going to be 12 gauge, 9 pellet, double-aught buckshot. But what does that mean, double-aught buckshot? Buckshot sizes, just like birdshot sizes and gauge, as the number gets smaller, the size of each individual pellet gets bigger. So the smallest factory-loaded buckshot that you'll typically see is a number 4, which is a 24 caliber BB. Moving all the way up to triple-aught buck, which I've seen in some of the federal Magnum loads, and even a little bit bigger than that. But moving down the ladder, you get to a double-aught buckshot, and it is a 33 caliber pellet, or a triple-aught buckshot, which is a 36 caliber pellet, the same diameter as, say, like a 38 special or something like that. So much larger per pellet than a number 4 buck. Now, while buckshot is predominantly available in the most common gauges like 12, 20, and 410, you can find it in other gauges as well. But one thing to note about buckshot types, for example, in our range, we only allow double-aught buckshot or larger in size pellets. Depending on what gauge you're shooting, that may not be an option for you because the diameter of each shell by gauge is going to be different. that will affect what kind of pellets you can fit and how many number of each you can fit inside of the shell. So for example, a very common load in a 20 gauge is 20 pellets of number 3 buckshot, so 25 caliber. They pick that load because it'll stack neatly the smaller pellet in the smaller shell. Same thing with, say, a 410, for example. You'll very commonly see triple-aught buckshot stacked one on top of another in the shell because that's the largest that they can fit inside of that particular shell type. Moving on, we have slugs. So what a slug is, essentially, is instead of firing a number of smaller projectiles, you are instead firing one bore-sized or almost bore-sized projectile, depending on the type of slug. One of the most common misconceptions that I run into in dealing with shotguns is people that see rifled slug written on a box and they're not really sure what that means. Rifled. Does my barrel need to be rifled? I don't understand. So you'll also sometimes see these referred to as Foster style slugs or Foster slugs. But what a rifled slug is a slug, in this example a 12 gauge slug, that has ridges cut into the slug, or cast rather, into the slug. That is in some way going to impart a spin stabilization on the projectile through a smoothbore barrel. So you can fire a rifled or Foster slug through most any shotgun, depending on what the manufacturer specifications are for that gun, that load, and its tolerance for chokes. But that does not mean that you have to shoot it through a rifled barrel. That's talking about the slug itself. So moving on from the rifled or Foster slug, we have a Sabo slug. So these slugs do require rifled barrels, or some manufacturers say you can use rifled choke tubes, and we'll talk about those in a second. But what a Sabo slug is a sub-caliber or sub-gauge projectile that is inside of a plastic sabot. It's French for shoe. That wad, specialty wad, is holding the projectile, and that is what's going to engage with the rifling of the shotgun barrel to spin stabilize the projectile. And when it leaves the barrel, the sabot comes off of the slug, which is now spinning just like a rifle-fired bullet or a bullet fired from your handgun. That's going to travel downrange typically more accurately than something shot out of a smoothbore would be, and it can give you very good results out to extended ranges. Savage makes bolt-action versions of their 110 series, the 212 and the 220, which are bolt-action rifled barreled shotguns that produce excellent results with something like this Hornady SST out to ranges of 300 plus yards. One last thing about slugs in particular. So if your gun is cut to accept interchangeable chokes, then one thing you can do to improve your accuracy if you have a smoothbore gun is use what's called a rifled choke. So it is a choke tube that goes in the end of the barrel that has rifling cut into it. So it will engage with things like a rifled or Foster slug that will impart better spin stabilization onto the slug to give you better results out to ranges like 100 or 150 yards, and can significantly tighten up patterns versus a smoothbore barrel. This effect is especially noticeable on shorter barrel lengths where you may not have the best slug gun to begin with, but any shotgun can benefit from that, again, depending on the specifications for your shotgun and for that slug. Now, some Sabos will also work with rifled chokes. Most of the ones that I'm familiar with, they recommend only using through fully rifled barrels. And a fully rifled barrel can shoot either of these projectiles accurately. But you definitely don't want to shoot a Sabo through a smoothbore barrel without any kind of spin stabilization because it will not stabilize that projectile. And what ends up happening a lot of the time, if we see it on our range, is that somewhere around 10 to 15 yards, that slug starts to fly sideways, and it is not going to hit where you want it to or do what you want it to when it hits the intended target. That about does it for today's video on the bare bones basics of different types of shotgun ammunition. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out to us directly, leave us a comment on the video, like, share, and subscribe. Check us out on all of our social medias, and as always, we'll see you on the range.